I love October. There was just something about the atmosphere and traditions that absolutely captivated me. That and all the free candy I had accumulated as a kid. It wasn't until I had gotten older, though, that I actually started to appreciate the autumn months. The weather gets cooler, the multicolored leaves that pepper the ground, and the spooky decorum that people spend way too much money on. All of that just seemed to resonate with me, long after I had hung up my candy bucket. One of my favorite things to do during October is enjoy the multitude of scary attractions that plague my city this time of year. From the cheesy haunted houses constructed from cardboard and trailers, to the vast labyrinths of expertly crafted scares, I went to them all. When I was a kid, my mother would never take me to these things. Not that I was too little, quite the contrary. It was she who was too apprehensive about going. The first haunted house I went to was in high school with a few close friends. It was your run-of-the-mill two-story building with very basic scares. Though, admittedly, not having been to one of these before, most of those scares got me pretty good. It seemed like every year after that, my friends and I would all get together and we'd hit up a few of the new attractions in town. This year would be no different, as my friend Mark had called me a few days ago regarding a brand new haunted attraction opening up at the edge of the city. He told me it was a haunted hayride, and that he read about it in the paper. As we spoke, he told me that he tried to look up the attraction online, but there was very little information on it. It had no website, and the few people who have mentioned it only stated that they haven't been but wanted to go. I told him that it sounded like fun and to call the others of our little group to see if anyone else wanted to go. He agreed, and within a few hours he texted me back to say that Kate and Jim also wanted to go as well. Since the grand opening of the hayride was on the 1st of the month, we all agreed on a time, and Mark said he'd be willing to drive us. The first had arrived, and I had gotten off work when Mark texted me telling me that he was on his way. I quickly got changed, and not long after that, I had received a new text telling me he was here. I hopped into his car and saw that he had already picked up Jim and Kate. We laughed and chatted the entire drive to the hayride. As we got a bit closer to our destination, I asked Mark if he had any more knowledge regarding the attraction. He told me that he didn't know much, but he did bring along the flyer that was in his newspaper. He handed it to me and I looked it over. He was right. There wasn't a whole lot to go off of. It was just a black piece of paper with what looked to be poorly photoshopped stalks of corn on it. In the center it said Haunted Hayride, and below that was an address. I punched in the address into my phone, and it took a minute for my GPS to find it. Eventually, a red dot appeared in the middle of nowhere, one which we were steadily closing in on. We pulled off the main highway onto a very uneven dirt road. Rows of corn stalks lined the road like walls on either side of us, guiding us further and further inward. I was beginning to wonder the legitimacy of this business. It seemed like no one but us were heading to this place. But Jim piped up from the back saying that maybe people didn't realize that it was opening day. Hearing this put me slightly at ease, and after nearly 20 minutes on that dirt road, we began to see lights in the distance. We pulled into a clearing that had a large barn set up with various spooky decor strewn about. Pumpkins and fake skeletons and the like. Orange and yellow lights on strings gave the entire area a very eerie atmosphere. As we drove through, we could see 3 carts attached to tractors lined up off to the side. We looked over and saw a few parked cars nearby, so we parked next to them and got out. As we all stood there looking like lost children, an older man walked up to us and asked us if we were here for the hayride, as if there would be any other reason to be out in the middle of nowhere. We nodded, and he led us over to a small booth. He stepped inside through the back door and greeted us once again. We asked him the cost of admission, and he replied $10 per person. That was actually a lot cheaper than a lot of the places we have been to in the past, so we all nodded to one another. Before we paid, though, he mentioned that it being the grand opening, not all of the elements, he called them, were in place, but that it was still sure to terrify us. We handed over our cash and his smile grew wider. We asked if he had other patrons aside from us and he just shook his head, telling us that we were the first. He then pointed over to the tractors and said that Chris would take us out on the ride. As we glanced over, we saw a rather tall and skinny guy wearing a black hoodie and dark-colored jeans. He was leaning against one of the tractors smoking a cigarette. We walked up and asked him if he was the one to take us out. He nodded, put out his cigarette, and told us to hop in the back. We all climbed into that hay-filled cart and sat with uncertainty as Chris started up the tractor. He put it in drive and we all lurched back as he drove onto the path into the field. We laughed and joked with one another while keeping an eye out for anything spooky, though it was nearly impossible to see more than a few feet away from us once we left the glow of the string lights behind. 5 minutes passed by, then 10, then 15. Nothing was happening and we were quickly realizing that maybe this wasn't the greatest idea after all. When suddenly, the tractor's engine seemed to die out. We all shook in our seats as the cart came to a stop. We all then turned our attention to Chris, but he wasn't there. I asked Mark and Jim if they had seen what happened to him, and they told me that they hadn't been paying attention. I looked around for a moment before calling out Chris's name. Of course, there was no response. Kate chimed in saying that maybe this was part of the ride, and Jim nodded in agreement with her. While it was possible that were the case, I had never been on a hayride where the driver straight up ditched us before. Just as we were beginning to discuss what to do, I heard a noise coming from the field to our left. It sounded like a clicking sound. It reminded me of the sound the predator makes. The sound drifted in and out before fading away entirely. I called out once more to Chris, stating that it was time to take us back. Again, there was no response. I eventually crawled over the cart to the tractor. I sat down and looked to see if the keys were still in the ignition. They weren't. I looked back to my friends in the cart and was about to tell them that we might have to walk back, but I couldn't find my voice to speak. There was something sitting on the back of the cart. Something which my friends hadn't noticed yet. They all looked at me expectantly as I stared at this thing on the back of the cart. Even with the lightless sky, I could still see it quite clearly with how close it was. Its head was beastly. It had dark black fur covering its form entirely. Its arms and legs were extremely long, which would have made how it was sitting on the back of the cart almost comical if I wasn't so terrified. It sat in an almost perched position, and despite its close proximity, it made no sound whatsoever. And although it had 3 other people between me and it never took its eyes off me. After a few seconds of unresponsiveness on my part, my friends all finally turned to see what had halted me. The collective screams of my group seemed to carry over the cornstalks for miles. Jim and Kate both jumped off the cart onto the ground, followed closely by Mark. I didn't move. Neither did the creature. My eyes were locked on this thing. My friends had all fled the area, sprinting back towards that barn, while I remained alone. I wanted to run too, but I was so scared that I couldn't even think straight, let alone run away. It then slowly reached out one of its arms and placed it onto the cart, followed by the other, followed by its legs. It was now crawling closer and closer to me. As it drew nearer, I could see its face even clearer, though I didn't want to look at it. The closest thing I can think to describe it as would be a bat. It had a short snout-like nose, with small yet pointed ears protruding from the sides of its head. Black, empty eyes stared into mine with no semblance of emotion. Like I mentioned before, its entire body was covered in a thick layer of dark fur. I was silently praying that it was just a guy in a suit, but that was quickly banished when it opened its mouth. Rows of dagger-like teeth lined its mouth. I could feel the heat of its breath coast across my face. The acrid scent of its odor wafted into my nostrils. As it did that, I heard that same clicking sound I heard earlier. It seemed like it was preparing to bite me, when suddenly my left arm, which had been propping me up to this point, buckled, and I fell out of the tractor. My face collided with the cold dirt below, and I could feel my senses rush back into me. I quickly picked myself up off the ground and began running back towards the barn. The entire sprint back, I could hear those clicks all around me, and it seemed like that creature was only a few steps behind me. A few moments later, I burst out of the cornfield into the glow of the lights above. All of my friends were already in the car, debating about whether or not they should leave me behind. Some friends, right? As I made my way over to the car, I looked around for the old man or any sign of Chris, but they were both nowhere to be found. I got into the car and we drove all the way back home in utter silence. We haven't spoken to each other since then, and I don't think that'll change for a while. If any of you out there are planning on going to one of the multiple haunted attractions popping up across the nation, please be careful. You might just be going for some cheap scares, but you may very well end up with more than you bargained for. As for hayrides in particular, well, I can tell you that I certainly won't ever be going back to one in my life. There was one last thing I can't shake from my mind, though. It's something that strange old man said to us. He said that not all of the elements were in place, meaning that there might be more of those things out there. Or maybe even things that are much, much worse.